The morning of October 8th, 2009, started like any other Thursday in the small town of Eufaula, Oklahoma. Kids were getting ready for school, parents grabbing their coffee, and the autumn air carried that crisp promise of winter just around the corner. But for the Jamison family, this ordinary Thursday would become the beginning of one of America's most puzzling mysteries. Bobby Jamison was loading his pickup truck that morning, his movements captured by the family's own security camera mounted outside their modest home on Dubois Avenue. At 44, Bobby was a man who had seen his share of struggles. A gas station attendant by trade, he carried himself with the quiet determination of someone who had worked hard for everything he had. His back often gave him trouble from an old injury, but he never let it slow him down when it came to providing for his family. His wife, Sherilyn, was 40 and the kind of woman who could light up a room with her smile. She had blonde hair that caught the sunlight and a laugh that her neighbors would later remember with fondness. Sherilyn worked various jobs over the years, but her main focus had always been their daughter, Madison. At 6 years old, Madison was the center of their world, a bright, curious little girl with her mother's smile and her father's stubborn streak. The family had been talking for weeks about buying land. Not just any land, but a specific 40-acre plot in the Sans Bois Mountains near Red Oak, about 30 miles from their home. It wasn't exactly prime real estate. The area was remote, heavily forested, and accessible only by rough dirt roads. But Bobby and Sherilyn saw something in it that others might have missed. Maybe it was the promise of space, of privacy, of a place where they could build something of their own. That Thursday morning, they were planning to drive out and take another look at the property. It would be their second visit to the area. The first time, they had met with a local man who was helping them explore their options. The land was cheap, which was important for a family living paycheck to paycheck, but it came with challenges. There was no electricity, no running water, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. The security camera footage from that morning shows something that would later puzzle investigators and haunt everyone who watched it. Bobby and Sherilyn can be seen making multiple trips back and forth between their house and the truck. They're moving deliberately, almost methodically, but there's something odd about their behavior. They appear to be in a trance-like state, moving slowly and strangely, not talking to each other in the way a normal couple would when loading up for a family trip. At one point, Bobby stops mid-stride and just stands there for several long seconds, as if he's forgotten what he was doing. Sherilyn does something similar, pausing with an item in her hands, staring off into the distance. Little Madison can be seen in the frame too, but she seems normal, acting like any 6-year-old would occasionally skipping, looking around with curiosity, unaware that anything might be amiss with her parents. The footage is grainy and silent, but it would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in what was about to unfold. Law enforcement officials who later viewed the tape described the family's behavior as bizarre and not normal. Some said it looked like they were sleepwalking or under the influence of something, but there was no evidence to suggest drug use. What the camera captured was a family loading their white pickup truck for what should have been a simple day trip to look at property. Bobby had brought along a .22 caliber pistol, which wasn't unusual for someone venturing into remote mountain areas where wild animals might pose a threat. Sherilyn had packed some snacks and water. They had their cell phones, their identification, and something else that would later become a major piece of the puzzle, a large amount of cash. Nobody knows exactly why the Jamisons had $32,000 in cash with them that day. This wasn't typical behavior for the family. Friends and relatives would later tell investigators that Bobby and Sherilyn never carried large sums of money. Bobby worked at a gas station, and while Sherilyn brought in some income from various jobs, they were not wealthy people. Where the money came from and why they had it remains one of many unanswered questions. The morning was proceeding normally for everyone else in Eufaula, a town of about 3,000 people situated on the shores of Lake Eufaula in eastern Oklahoma. It's the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, where news travels fast, and where a family going missing would shake the entire community. The town had been founded in the late 1800s and had that distinctly American small-town feel, tree-lined streets, local diners where the coffee was always fresh, and a pace of life that moved just a little slower than the big cities. But even in small towns like Eufaula, families can have their troubles, and the Jamisons were no exception. Bobby's relationship with his father had been strained for years. In fact, just months before their disappearance, Bobby had filed a restraining order against his dad, claiming that the older man had threatened to kill him and his family. The court documents painted a picture of a family torn apart by old resentments and bitter arguments. Bobby's father had allegedly made threats, saying he was going to kill Bobby and that he wanted him to suffer. These weren't just angry words thrown around during a heated argument, they were serious enough that Bobby felt the need to involve the law. The restraining order was granted, but it did little to ease the tension within the family. Some people who knew them wondered if this family drama might have something to do with what was about to happen. Sherilyn had her own set of challenges. She had been dealing with depression and anxiety, struggles that were made worse by the family's financial situation. Money was always tight, and the stress of making ends meet weighed heavily on her. She had been taking medication for her mental health, and some family members later wondered if the combination of medications might have affected her behavior that morning. Despite their problems, those who knew the Jamisons described them as a loving family. Bobby might have been quiet and reserved, but he adored his daughter. Sherilyn could be moody sometimes, but she was devoted to Madison. And little Madison was, by all accounts, a normal, happy 6-year-old who loved playing with her dolls and watching cartoons. The last person to see the Jamison family alive was a local man who lived in the mountains near Red Oak. He would later tell investigators that he had seen them in the area on October 8th, looking at the property they were considering buying. According to his account, they seemed normal, engaged in typical conversations about the land, asking practical questions about access roads and property lines. He remembered Madison playing nearby while her parents talked business. She was picking up rocks and sticks, the way children do when adults are having boring grown-up conversations. There was nothing about the family that struck him as unusual or concerning. They were just another family looking at rural property, something he had seen many times before. But after that encounter, the Jamison family simply vanished. When they didn't return home that evening, it didn't immediately raise alarms. Sometimes when families are looking at remote property, they might decide to camp overnight or explore the area more thoroughly. Bobby and Sherilyn might have decided to make a mini vacation out of the trip, especially with Madison along for the adventure. But as Thursday turned to Friday and Friday turned to Saturday, their absence became more concerning. Bobby was scheduled to work at the gas station, and he had never been the type to just not show up without calling. Sherilyn had responsibilities too, and Madison had school. The family might have been spontaneous sometimes, but they weren't irresponsible. By the time the weekend arrived, family members and friends were starting to worry. Phone calls to Bobby and Sherilyn's cell phones went straight to voicemail. The house on Dubois Avenue sat empty, with their dog Macy nowhere to be found either. The family car was gone, along with the family. It was clear that something was wrong, but nobody could have imagined just how wrong things had gone. On October 16th, 2009, 8 days after the Jamison family had last been seen, a group of hunters made a discovery in the remote mountains of Latimer County. They found the family's white pickup truck abandoned on a dirt road in an area so isolated that cell phone service was spotty at best. The truck was parked in a way that suggested it hadn't broken down. It was positioned as if someone had deliberately stopped there. Inside the truck, investigators found a scene that would puzzle them for years to come. The family's dog, Macy, was still inside the vehicle, malnourished and dehydrated but alive. The poor animal had been trapped in the truck for over a week, surviving on whatever moisture she could find. Her condition suggested that the family had not planned to be away from the truck for very long. But it wasn't just Macy that investigators found in the truck. All of the family's personal belongings were still there, laid out in a way that suggested they had intended to return. Bobby's wallet was there, along with Sherilyn's purse. Their identification cards, credit cards, and cell phones were all accounted for. The GPS system they had brought to help navigate the backwoods roads was still plugged into the dashboard. Most shocking of all was the money, $32,000 in cash, stacked neatly and left behind like it meant nothing at all. For a family that struggled financially, leaving that amount of money in an abandoned truck made no sense whatsoever. If they had been planning to disappear voluntarily, surely they would have taken the cash with them. If they had been the victims of a crime, any robber would have taken the money first. The gun Bobby had brought for protection was missing, though that could be explained easily enough. If the family had left the truck to walk somewhere, Bobby would have naturally taken the weapon with him for safety. But where had they gone and why? Investigators began processing the scene immediately, but the truck and its contents raised more questions than answers. There were no signs of a struggle inside the vehicle. No blood, no evidence of violence, no indication that the family had been forced to leave against their will. It looked as though they had simply parked the truck, gathered a few things, and walked away into the wilderness. But walking away to where and why? The area where the truck was found was challenging terrain even for experienced hikers. The Sans Bois Mountains are covered in dense forest, steep ravines, and thick underbrush. Wild animals, including bears and mountain lions, call the region home. The weather in October can be unpredictable, with temperatures dropping significantly at night. It was not the kind of place where a family with a 6-year-old would go for a casual walk, especially as evening approached. Search teams were organized immediately. Volunteers from across southeastern Oklahoma joined law enforcement officers in combing through miles of rough wilderness. Helicopters flew overhead, their crews scanning the forest canopy for any sign of the missing family. Bloodhounds were brought in to try to pick up a scent trail from the abandoned truck. The searches continued for weeks, expanding outward from the truck in ever-widening circles. Every old cabin, every hunting blind, every cave and overhanging rock formation was checked and rechecked. The terrain was unforgiving, and the searches were dangerous, but the teams pressed on, driven by the hope that the family might still be found alive. As the searches continued, investigators began looking into the family's background more deeply. They interviewed friends, relatives, and coworkers, trying to piece together the events leading up to October 8th and understand why the Jamisons might have been in the mountains that day. What they discovered was a family dealing with multiple stressors. The conflict with Bobby's father was just one issue among many. There were financial pressures, health problems, and what some described as strange behavior in the weeks leading up to their disappearance. Several people who knew the family mentioned that Bobby and Sherilyn had been acting oddly in the months before they vanished. They seemed paranoid at times, worried about threats that others couldn't see. Sherilyn, in particular, had been expressing concerns about supernatural phenomena. She had told people that she believed their house was haunted and that evil spirits were causing problems for the family. This might have sounded like the ramblings of someone dealing with mental health issues, but other family members had noticed strange things too. There were reports of unexplained sounds in the house, objects moving on their own, and an overall sense of unease that seemed to permeate the Jamison home in the weeks before they disappeared. Some investigators wondered if these supernatural concerns might have influenced the family's decision to look at remote property. Perhaps they were trying to get away from whatever was troubling them in their current home. The isolation of the mountain property might have seemed appealing to a family that felt they were being watched or threatened. But even if supernatural fears had motivated their interest in the remote land, it still didn't explain what happened to them once they reached the mountains. Had they encountered someone with malicious intent? Had they become lost in the wilderness? Had there been an accident that claimed all three of their lives? The investigation expanded beyond the immediate area of the disappearance. Police looked into the possibility that the family might have staged their own vanishing, perhaps to escape debts or threats. But the evidence didn't support this theory. The $32,000 in cash left behind would have been crucial for anyone trying to start a new life elsewhere. Their belongings, their identification, their dog, everything suggested that they had expected to return to the truck. Investigators also considered the possibility of foul play. The area where the truck was found was known to have issues with drug activity. Methamphetamine production was a problem in some of the remote areas of southeastern Oklahoma, and there had been instances of people stumbling upon illegal operations and facing violent consequences. Could the Jamison family have accidentally discovered a drug lab or encountered people involved in illegal activities? It was certainly possible, but there was no direct evidence to support this theory. No drug paraphernalia was found in the area, no reports of unusual activity from other visitors to the region. The family's cell phones provided some clues, but not the breakthrough investigators were hoping for. The phones showed that they had been in the area where the truck was found, which confirmed the timeline established by the witness who had seen them. But the phones had lost signal at some point, either because of the remote location or because they had been damaged or destroyed. As weeks turned into months, the case began to grow cold. Despite extensive searches and hundreds of hours of investigative work, there was no trace of Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison Jamison. The family seemed to have vanished as completely as if they had never existed. The community of Eufaula was shaken by the disappearance. In small towns, when tragedy strikes one family, it affects everyone. People began locking their doors who had never felt the need to before. Parents kept a closer eye on their children. The sense of safety and security that had always been a hallmark of small-town life was shattered. Sherilyn's mother, Connie Cockatton, became the public face of the family's anguish. She appeared on local news programs, pleading for information about her daughter, son-in-law, and granddaughter. She organized search parties, distributed flyers, and never stopped believing that somehow, someway, her family would be found. They were good people, she would tell reporters, tears in her eyes. They loved each other, and they loved that little girl more than anything in this world. Something terrible happened to them, and we just want to know what. The not knowing was perhaps the cruelest part of the ordeal. When someone dies, there's a finality to it, a terrible clarity that allows the grieving process to begin. But when people simply vanish, their loved ones are left in limbo, unable to mourn and unable to hope. As winter approached, the searches became more difficult and less frequent. Snow began to dust the highest peaks of the Sans Bois Mountains, and the chances of finding the family alive diminished with each passing day. But the case remained active, and investigators continued to follow up on every tip, every lead, every possibility. One of the most intriguing aspects of the case was the security camera footage from the morning of October 8th. Law enforcement officials studied the tape frame by frame, trying to understand what might have been affecting the family's behavior. Some experts suggested that Bobby and Sherilyn appeared to be under the influence of some kind of drug, but toxicology tests couldn't be performed without bodies. Others theorized that the strange behavior might have been related to the stress and anxiety the family had been experiencing. People dealing with severe mental health issues sometimes exhibit unusual physical movements and behaviors. The medication Sherilyn was taking for her depression might have had side effects that weren't immediately apparent. But the most disturbing possibility was that the family's odd behavior that morning was connected to whatever fate awaited them in the mountains. Had they been threatened? Were they being coerced by someone off camera? The surveillance footage raised these questions but provided no answers. As 2009 turned to 2010, the Jamison family disappearance became one of Oklahoma's most high-profile missing persons cases. It was featured on television shows, written about in newspapers across the country, and discussed on internet forums devoted to unsolved mysteries. The case had all the elements that capture public attention: a missing child, mysterious circumstances, and a complete lack of resolution. Amateur investigators and armchair detectives proposed dozens of theories about what might have happened. Some focused on the family's financial problems and wondered if Bobby might have been involved in illegal activities to raise money. Others pointed to the supernatural elements of the story and suggested that the family might have encountered something beyond normal human experience. The most persistent theories, however, centered on more conventional explanations. The wilderness where the family disappeared was dangerous even for experienced outdoorsmen. It was possible that they had simply become lost, suffered an accident, or encountered wild animals. With winter approaching, exposure to the elements could have been fatal, especially for a young child. But even these logical explanations had problems. If the family had died from natural causes in the wilderness, where were their bodies? Extensive searches had covered thousands of acres, and cadaver dogs had been used to detect any scent of decomposition. Yet nothing had been found. The case took an emotional toll on everyone involved. The investigators who had worked tirelessly to find the family struggled with their inability to provide answers. The volunteers who had spent weekends searching rough terrain went home exhausted and discouraged. The family members who had pinned their hopes on each new lead found themselves disappointed again and again. For the residents of Eufaula, the Jamison family's disappearance became a defining moment in their community's history. It was the kind of tragedy that gets talked about for years, passed down from one generation to the next, as a cautionary tale about how quickly life can change. But even as the immediate intensity of the investigation began to wane, those who had known and loved the Jamisons never gave up hope. Someone, somewhere, had to know what had happened to Bobby, Sherilyn, and little Madison. The truth was out there in those mountains, waiting to be discovered. As investigators continued their work and the family's loved ones maintained their vigil, none of them could have known that it would be nearly 4 years before the wilderness finally gave up its terrible secret. And when that day came, the discovery would raise even more questions about what had really happened to the Jamison family on that autumn day in 2009. The search for answers was far from over, but it would take a twist that no one expected, leading down paths that were darker and more mysterious than anyone had imagined. The truth about the Jamison family's fate was waiting in the mountains, hidden among the trees and undergrowth, and it would challenge everything that investigators thought they knew about the case. What had started as a simple family trip to look at property had become something else entirely, a mystery that would haunt southeastern Oklahoma for years to come and leave everyone wondering what evil might be lurking in those ancient, watching woods. The years that followed the Jamison family's disappearance were filled with false hopes and dead ends. Every few months, someone would call the tip line claiming to have seen Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison somewhere, at a gas station in Texas, in a grocery store in Arkansas, walking down a street in Kansas. Each report sent investigators scrambling to follow up, only to discover cases of mistaken identity or wishful thinking. The case had captured national attention, appearing on shows like Disappeared and Unsolved Mysteries. The story had all the elements that fascinated the public: a mysterious disappearance, strange circumstances, and theories that ranged from the mundane to the supernatural. Amateur investigators on internet forums dissected every detail, proposing elaborate theories about what might have happened to the family. But as 2010 became 2011 and 2011 became 2012, the active investigation began to wind down. There were simply no new leads to follow, no evidence to analyze, no witnesses to interview. The case remained open, but it had gone cold, joining the thousands of other unsolved missing persons cases across the country. For Sherilyn's mother, Connie Cockatton, the passage of time brought no relief from her anguish. She continued to organize search parties, even as volunteers became fewer and enthusiasm waned. She maintained a Facebook page dedicated to finding the family, posting updates and pleas for information. She never missed an opportunity to keep their story in the public eye, appearing on any television show or podcast that would have her. "I know they're out there somewhere," she would tell anyone who would listen. "A mother knows these things. They're waiting to come home." The not knowing was eating away at everyone who had loved the Jamisons. Sherilyn's friends found themselves unable to move on, caught between hope and despair. Bobby's coworkers at the gas station kept expecting him to walk through the door, ready to explain where he had been all this time. The neighbors on Dubois Avenue still looked for signs of life at the empty house, where the grass had grown tall and weeds had begun to take over the flower beds that Sherilyn had once tended with such care. Meanwhile, the theories about what had happened to the family continued to multiply and evolve. Some were based on logical analysis of the evidence, while others ventured into much stranger territory. The drug theory gained traction among some investigators and online amateur detectives. The large amount of cash found in the truck seemed to point toward some kind of illegal activity. Oklahoma had a serious methamphetamine problem, and the remote areas where the family had disappeared were known to be home to clandestine drug operations. According to this theory, Bobby might have become involved in drug trafficking as a way to solve the family's financial problems. The $32,000 could have been either payment for drugs or the proceeds from drug sales. The family's trip to the mountains might not have been about buying land at all, but about conducting some kind of drug transaction that went horribly wrong. Supporters of the drug theory pointed to reports from neighbors who claimed that Bobby and Sherilyn had been acting strangely in the months before their disappearance. Some said the couple had lost weight dramatically, which could be consistent with methamphetamine use. Others noted that their behavior had become increasingly paranoid and erratic, another possible sign of drug involvement. But the drug theory had significant problems. Family members vehemently denied that Bobby or Sherilyn had ever used illegal drugs, let alone trafficked in them. Bobby had held steady employment and had no criminal record. Sherilyn, despite her struggles with depression, had no history of substance abuse. Most importantly, if the family had been killed by drug dealers, why would the killers leave $32,000 behind? Another persistent theory focused on Bobby's troubled relationship with his father. The restraining order that Bobby had filed painted a picture of a dangerous family feud, with threats of violence and allegations of criminal activity. Some investigators wondered if the elder Jamison might have followed through on his threats, ambushing the family in the remote mountains where no one would witness the crime. This theory had some compelling elements. Bobby's father knew his son's habits and might have been able to predict where the family would be on that October day. The isolated location would have provided the perfect opportunity for an ambush. And the personal nature of the family conflict could explain why the money was left behind. This wasn't about robbery, but about revenge. But law enforcement officials had investigated this angle thoroughly and found no evidence to support it. Bobby's father had what appeared to be a solid alibi for October 8th, and despite the bitter nature of their dispute, there was no direct evidence linking him to the family's disappearance. The restraining order showed that Bobby feared his father, but fear and actual violence are two different things. Perhaps the most intriguing theories were those that focused on the family's reported interest in the supernatural. In the months before their disappearance, Sherilyn had allegedly become convinced that their house was haunted. She had told friends and family members about strange occurrences, unexplained sounds, objects moving on their own, and an overall sense of malevolent presence. Some people dismissed these reports as the product of Sherilyn's mental health struggles. Depression and anxiety can sometimes manifest in ways that include paranoid thoughts and altered perceptions of reality. The medications she was taking might have contributed to these experiences, creating side effects that she interpreted as supernatural phenomena. But other family members had reported strange experiences in the Jamison home as well. Bobby himself had mentioned feeling uncomfortable in the house, and visitors had sometimes left early, claiming they felt an overwhelming sense of unease. These reports were hard to dismiss entirely, especially given the context of what eventually happened to the family. According to the supernatural theory, the Jamisons might have been fleeing something paranormal that was plaguing their home. The remote mountain property they were considering might have seemed like an escape from whatever forces were tormenting them. But perhaps those same dark forces had followed them into the wilderness, leading to their ultimate fate. This theory was impossible to prove or disprove, but it resonated with people who believed that there were mysteries in the world that couldn't be explained by conventional logic. The strange behavior captured on the security camera footage seemed to support the idea that the family was under some kind of supernatural influence on the morning they disappeared. As the years passed, the case began to fade from the headlines, though it never completely disappeared from public consciousness. True crime enthusiasts continued to discuss it on forums and social media. Documentary filmmakers occasionally revisited the story. The Jamison family disappearance had become part of American folklore, a modern mystery that captured the imagination in the same way that stories of ghost ships and lost civilizations had done for previous generations. But for the people of Eufaula, the case was more than entertainment, it was a wound that wouldn't heal. The town had been marked by the tragedy, and residents found themselves looking over their shoulders more often, locking their doors more carefully, keeping closer watch on their children. The sense of safety that had always been a hallmark of small town life had been shattered, perhaps permanently. The house on Dubois Avenue stood empty, a constant reminder of the family that had once lived there. Eventually, the bank foreclosed on the property, and it was sold to new owners who had no connection to the tragic events that had taken place there. But even new ownership couldn't erase the memories or quiet the whispers about what might have happened to the people who had once called it home. Local law enforcement officials never officially closed the case, but as years passed without any new developments, it received less and less attention. Detective work requires fresh leads and new evidence, and the Jamison case had neither. The investigators who had worked tirelessly to find the family were eventually assigned to other cases, other mysteries, other tragedies that demanded their attention. But fate, it seemed, wasn't finished with the Jamison family story. On November 16, 2013, a group of hunters was making their way through the remote wilderness of Panola Mountain, about 3 miles from where the family's truck had been found over 4 years earlier. They were experienced outdoorsmen, familiar with the challenging terrain and the wildlife that called these mountains home. It was supposed to be a routine hunting trip, a chance to get away from civilization and enjoy the beauty of the Oklahoma wilderness. Instead, they stumbled upon a discovery that would reopen one of the state's most puzzling unsolved cases. Scattered among the trees and underbrush, the hunters found human skeletal remains. Not just one skeleton, but what appeared to be the remains of 3 people lying close together, as if they had died at the same time and in the same place. The bones were scattered and weathered, picked clean by animals and bleached white by years of exposure to the elements. The hunters immediately contacted law enforcement, and within hours, the remote mountain location was swarming with investigators, forensic specialists, and crime scene technicians. The area was cordoned off and searched methodically, with every bone, every scrap of clothing, every potential piece of evidence carefully cataloged and collected. Initial examination of the remains suggested that they belonged to 2 adults and 1 child, which matched the composition of the missing Jamison family. But positive identification would require DNA testing and forensic analysis that could take weeks or months to complete. Until then, investigators could only speculate about whether the 4 year search for Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison Jamison had finally come to an end. The location where the remains were found was significant. It was only about 3 miles from where the family's truck had been discovered, but it was in a different direction from where most of the search efforts had been concentrated. The terrain between the truck and the location of the remains was extremely difficult dense forest, steep slopes, and thick underbrush that would be challenging even for experienced hikers. How had the family ended up in that location? Had they walked there from their truck? Had they been taken there by someone else? Had they died at the truck location and their remains been moved by animals or other natural forces? Each possibility raised new questions about what had happened during those final hours of October 8, 2009. The condition of the remains made it impossible to determine an immediate cause of death. After 4 years in the wilderness, exposed to weather, wildlife, and the natural process of decomposition, the bones could tell investigators very little about how the Jamisons had died. There were no obvious signs of trauma, no bullet holes in skulls, no broken bones that might indicate a violent struggle. This absence of obvious evidence only deepened the mystery. If the family had been murdered, how had they been killed? If they had died from natural causes, what could have claimed the lives of all three family members at the same time? If they had died by suicide, where was the gun that Bobby had been carrying? And why would parents choose to end their daughter's life along with their own? The forensic analysis would take time, but investigators were cautiously optimistic that they had finally found the Jamison family. The location, the number of remains, and the estimated time since death all seemed to match the missing family. DNA testing would provide definitive confirmation, but most people involved in the case believed that the long search was finally over. For Connie Kakatin, the news was both heartbreaking and relieving. After 4 years of not knowing, of hoping against hope that her daughter, son in law, and granddaughter might still be alive somewhere, she was finally going to have answers. Not the answers she had hoped for, but answers nonetheless. "I always said I would never give up looking for them," she told reporters through tears. "I just never wanted to find them like this." The discovery of the remains reignited public interest in the Jamison case. News outlets that hadn't covered the story in years suddenly returned to it, interviewing family members, law enforcement officials, and anyone else who had been connected to the original investigation. The theories and speculation that had quieted over the years suddenly erupted again, as people tried to make sense of what the discovery of the bodies meant for understanding what had happened to the family. But even as the remains underwent forensic analysis, many of the core questions about the Jamison case remained unanswered. The discovery of the bodies was a crucial development, but it didn't automatically solve the mystery of what had happened to the family or who, if anyone, was responsible for their deaths. The location where the bodies were found became the subject of intense scrutiny. Investigators examined the terrain, looking for clues about how the family had ended up there. They interviewed the hunters who had found the remains, making sure that the discovery was genuine and not some kind of elaborate hoax or contaminated crime scene. The area was remote even by the standards of the Sans Bois Mountains. It was miles from the nearest road, accessible only by hiking trails that were barely visible and known only to the most experienced outdoorsmen. It was not the kind of place where a family with a 6-year-old would normally venture, especially not in the gathering darkness of an October evening. Had the family been forced to go there at gunpoint? Had they become lost and wandered into the wilderness in a desperate search for help? Had they made a conscious decision to go to that remote location for reasons that might never be fully understood? Each scenario had implications for understanding what had ultimately killed them. As winter approached in 2013, the forensic analysis continued. DNA samples were taken from the remains and compared to samples from known relatives of the Jamison family. Dental records were examined where possible. Clothing fragments found with the remains were analyzed to see if they matched items the family was known to have been wearing on the day they disappeared. The process was slow and meticulous, but eventually the results began to come in. The DNA analysis confirmed what investigators had suspected. The remains belonged to Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison Jamison. After 4 years, 2 months, and 8 days, the family had finally been found. But even with positive identification of the remains, the cause of death remained a mystery. The forensic examination found no evidence of obvious trauma, no signs of violence, no indication of how the family had died. The medical examiner's office classified the deaths as undetermined, which meant that science couldn't provide a definitive answer about what had killed the Jamisons. This lack of a clear cause of death only fueled more speculation and theory. Without evidence of violence, some people concluded that the family must have died from natural causes, perhaps exposure, dehydration, or some kind of medical emergency. But critics of this theory pointed out that all three family members dying from natural causes at the same time was extremely unlikely. Others suggested that the absence of obvious trauma might actually support a theory of poisoning or drug overdose. These causes of death might not leave visible marks on bones that had been exposed to the elements for years. But there was no evidence that the family had been involved with drugs and no clear motive for someone to poison them. The suicide theory gained some renewed attention after the bodies were found. The fact that the remains were found close together might suggest that the family had died at the same time and place, which could be consistent with a murder suicide scenario. But again, there were problems with this theory, most notably, the absence of the gun that Bobby had been carrying. As 2013 turned to 2014, the official investigation into the Jamison family deaths was winding down. The bodies had been found, the forensic analysis had been completed, and there was simply no evidence pointing toward any specific cause of death or any particular suspect. The case would remain officially open, but it was unlikely to receive much additional investigative attention unless new evidence emerged. For the family's loved ones, the discovery of the remains brought a kind of closure, but not the kind they had hoped for. They could finally lay Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison to rest, but they were left with more questions than answers about what had happened to them in those final hours. The memorial service for the Jamison family was held in early 2014, more than 4 years after they had disappeared. Hundreds of people attended, including many who had never met the family but had been touched by their story. There were tears for the lives that had been lost, especially for little Madison, who had never had the chance to grow up. But there was also anger and frustration that the truth about what had happened to the family might never be known. Someone, somewhere, knew more about the Jamison case than they were saying. Whether it was a witness who was afraid to come forward, a perpetrator who had never been caught, or someone who had information they didn't realize was important, the full truth remained hidden. On July 3, 2014, nearly 5 years after the Jamison family had disappeared, the Oklahoma Medical Examiner's Office made an official announcement that everyone had been expecting but dreading. The remains found in the Sands Boys Mountains belonged to Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison Jamison. The long nightmare of not knowing was finally over, but in its place came an even more disturbing reality. The forensic analysis had taken months to complete, but the results raised more questions than they answered. Due to the heavily decomposed state of the remains after 4 years in the wilderness, a cause of death could not be determined. The bones could tell scientists that these were the missing family members, but they couldn't reveal how they had died. What the examination did reveal, however, was something that would haunt everyone connected to the case for years to come. The bodies had been found lined up side by side, all face down, in what appeared to be an execution-style arrangement. This wasn't the random scatter of remains that would be expected from people who had died from exposure or gotten lost in the wilderness. This was something deliberate, something planned, something that spoke of human evil rather than natural tragedy. The positioning of the bodies was the detail that changed everything about how investigators and the public viewed the Jamison case. Three people don't die from hypothermia or dehydration in a perfectly straight line, all facing the same direction. Animals don't arrange skeletal remains in neat rows. Only human hands could have created the scene that the hunters had discovered in November 2013. For Sheriff Jesse James of Latimer County, the arrangement of the remains confirmed what many investigators had suspected all along. The Jamison family had been murdered. When you have three people lined up like that, he told reporters, it doesn't happen naturally. Someone put them there. But if the family had been executed, who had killed them and why? The lack of a clear motive continued to baffle investigators. The $32,000 left in their truck ruled out robbery as a motive. There were no known enemies who might have wanted to harm the entire family. Even Bobby's troubled relationship with his father didn't seem to provide an adequate explanation for such a calculated and brutal crime. The execution-style positioning suggested a level of cold-blooded planning that was chilling to contemplate. Whoever had killed the Jamisons hadn't acted in the heat of passion or during a robbery gone wrong. They had methodically arranged the bodies in a specific pattern, which suggested either a ritualistic element to the crime or a killer who wanted to send a message. But what message and to whom? Some investigators began to focus more seriously on the possibility that the family had stumbled upon illegal drug activity in the remote mountains. The methamphetamine trade was known to operate in the area, and people involved in drug manufacturing could be extremely violent when they felt threatened by outsiders. According to this theory, the Jamisons might have accidentally discovered a meth lab or witnessed drug transactions during their visit to look at property. The drug dealers, fearing that the family would report what they had seen to law enforcement, might have decided that all three family members had to be eliminated to protect their operation. The execution style arrangement of the bodies could have been intended to send a message to other potential witnesses. This is what happens to people who see too much and might talk to the police. The $32,000 left in the truck might not have been taken because the killers were focused on eliminating witnesses rather than committing robbery. This theory had some compelling elements, but it also had significant weaknesses. If drug dealers had killed the family, why wait several days to do it? The family had been missing for over a week before their truck was found, which suggested they had been killed shortly after they disappeared. But if they had witnessed something incriminating on October 8th, why not kill them immediately instead of holding them captive for days? Other investigators favored a different theory, that the family had been killed by someone they knew, possibly someone who had lured them to the remote location, specifically to murder them. The fact that they had brought a large amount of cash suggested they might have been planning to make some kind of purchase or payment. Perhaps they had been set up by someone who had promised to sell them something, but had actually planned to rob and kill them all along. But again, this theory had problems. If the motive was robbery, why leave the money behind? And what could the family have been planning to buy that would require $32,000 in cash and a trip to such a remote location? As the investigation continued, attention began to focus on the property that the Jamisons had been planning to visit. The 40-acre plot was owned by a man who lived in the area, and investigators interviewed him extensively about his interactions with the family. He maintained that he had only met them briefly and knew nothing about their disappearance, and there was no evidence to contradict his story. But some investigators wondered if there might be other people connected to the property who hadn't come forward. Rural areas like the Sans Bois Mountains often attracted people who wanted to stay off the radar survivalists, drug manufacturers, people running from the law or from their past. Had the Jamisons encountered one of these hidden residents during their visit? The supernatural theories that had surrounded the case from the beginning gained new credibility among some people after the discovery of the bodies. The execution style arrangement seemed to suggest some kind of ritualistic killing, which fed into speculation about occult activity in the mountains. Sherilyn's reported concerns about evil spirits and supernatural phenomena in their home took on new significance in light of how her family's story had ended. Some people wondered if she had been sensing something real, not ghosts or demons, but human evil that was somehow connected to their ultimate fate. There were whispers about satanic cults operating in remote areas, about ritualistic murders designed to harness supernatural power, about ancient evils that still haunted the Oklahoma wilderness. These theories were impossible to prove or disprove, but they resonated with people who felt that conventional explanations couldn't account for the strange circumstances of the case. The more investigators learned about the final positioning of the remains, the more disturbing the case became. The family had been found laid out nearly side by side, all face down, in a formation that seemed almost impossible to achieve naturally. It would have required someone to carefully position each body after death, treating human beings like objects to be arranged. The psychological profile of someone capable of such an act was chilling. This wasn't a crime of passion or even a typical murder for gain. This was the work of someone who was either completely without human empathy or was operating under some belief system that allowed them to treat a family, including a 6-year-old child, as nothing more than props in some twisted performance. Little Madison's presence in the lineup was perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the discovery. Whatever had happened to the Jamison family, it had claimed the life of an innocent child who had done nothing wrong except accompany her parents on what should have been a routine trip to look at property. The image of her small skeleton, arranged alongside her parents, haunted everyone who worked on the case. As 2014 progressed, the official investigation began to slow down once again. Despite the shocking revelation about how the bodies had been positioned, there was still no physical evidence pointing to a specific perpetrator. No witnesses had come forward with useful information. No suspects had emerged who seemed capable of such a calculated crime. The case had generated thousands of tips over the years, but none had led to a breakthrough. Every lead had been followed up, every theory had been investigated, every possible connection had been explored. The truth seemed as elusive as ever, hidden somewhere in those silent mountains that had already kept their secret for so long. For Connie Kakatin, Sherilyn's mother, the revelation about the positioning of the bodies brought new anguish. It was one thing to lose her family to some tragic accident or even a random act of violence. It was another thing entirely to know that they had been subjected to what appeared to be a deliberate, ritualistic murder. They didn't deserve this, she told reporters through tears. Nobody deserves to die like that, especially not a little girl. Whoever did this is a monster, and they're still out there. The knowledge that the killer or killers might still be free was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the case's resolution. Somewhere, possibly still in Oklahoma, possibly long gone, was someone who had committed one of the most calculated and cold-blooded crimes in the state's history. They had gotten away with it, at least for now. As the years passed after 2014, the Jamison case gradually settled into its place as one of America's most notorious unsolved crimes. It appeared in true crime documentaries, was featured in books about unsolved mysteries, and continued to generate discussion on online forums devoted to cold cases. But for all the attention the case received, no new evidence emerged. No witness came forward with information that could crack the case. No deathbed confession revealed the identity of the killer. The truth remained as hidden as ever, buried somewhere in those ancient mountains, along with the remains of its victims. The house on Dubois Avenue eventually sold to new owners who had no connection to the tragic events that had taken place there. Life in Eufaula slowly returned to normal, though residents never forgot the family that had vanished from their community and the mystery that still surrounded their fate. The property in the Sands Boys Mountains that the Jamisons had been interested in purchasing was eventually sold to someone else. The new owner was aware of the connection to the murder case, but decided to buy the land anyway. Life, it seemed, had a way of moving forward even in the shadow of unsolved tragedy. But in the end, the most haunting aspect of the Jamison family case wasn't the mystery itself. It was the human cost. Three people, including an innocent child, had been taken from a world that still had so much to offer them. Bobby Jamison would never see another sunrise over the Oklahoma plains. Sherilyn would never again laugh with her friends or hug her daughter. And little Madison would never grow up, never go to her high school prom, never have children of her own. The final, terrible truth about the Jamison family case was that some mysteries are never meant to be solved. Some evil is too deep, too carefully hidden, too protected by silence and fear to ever be brought into the light. The mountains that had claimed the Jamison family kept their secrets, and all the investigation and speculation in the world couldn't force them to give up what they knew. On quiet nights in southeastern Oklahoma, when the wind moves through the trees of the Sands Boys Mountains, some people say you can still hear echoes of what happened there on that autumn day in 2009. Not ghostly voices or supernatural phenomena, but something more real and more terrifying, the sound of human evil walking free in a world that still doesn't understand what it's capable of. The Jamison family had gone to the mountains looking for a new beginning, a piece of land where they could build a better life. Instead, they found something that was ancient and dark and hungry, something that took everything from them and gave nothing back but questions that would never be answered. Their story became a warning about the dangers that can lurk in even the most beautiful places, about the evil that can hide behind the most ordinary faces, about the fragility of safety in a world where monsters don't always look like monsters. And in the end, perhaps that was the most chilling revelation of all, not that the Jamison family had been murdered, but that their killer walked away from that mountain, returned to normal life, and might still be out there, waiting for the next family to drive down the wrong dirt road on the wrong day. The case files remain open, gathering dust in a sheriff's office in eastern Oklahoma. The evidence sits in storage, waiting for some new development that might never come. And somewhere in America, a killer who arranged three human beings in a line like broken dolls continues to live free, carrying the secret of what really happened to Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison Jamison on that terrible day, when a family trip became a journey into darkness from which they would never return. The mountains remember, even if they will never tell. And the Jamison family's story endures, a mystery wrapped in tragedy, a reminder that some questions are more terrifying than any answer could ever be.